So here are today's objectives, what we're going to kind of cover in this presentation. We want to hear from our community partners that we've invited here tonight about their role when working with victims of sexual violence. So we are going to hear the advocacy side of it from myself and Angie. And then we'll go into the SANE, which is the sexual assault nurse examination on the medical side of things. We'll also get a law enforcement perspective, as well as a prosecution and criminal proceeding perspective. We'll also be hearing from UW Stout about Title IX investigations and options for student survivors, as well as mental health care following assault. Then after that, we'll be opening it up to questions from the community, as well as reading some of the survivor love letters that we received either in our mailbox or online. And we'll also be allowing space for survivors and allies to share.
So Kat and I are just going to start by introducing ourselves. So my name is Angie. I'm the Director of Sexual Assault Victim Services at the Bridge to Hope.
And I'm Kat. I am the Sexual Assault Victim Advocate and Campus Advocate at UW Stout through the Bridge to Hope.
So these are some of the other lovely ladies that we work with. And then the Bridge to Hope, how can we help? Well, we offer free and confidential support and resources to victims and survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking. And this includes our pantry, our diaper program, our emergency shelter. We also have 24/7 text and crisis hotline numbers that folks can reach us either by calling our crisis line, they can text us, they can reach us through our Facebook, our Instagram, our Snapchat. And then we walk through options with our survivors. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the first option that we really talk about with survivors if after an assault is whether or not to receive medical attention or receive a SANE exam. So Candace Aspen, she's a SANE nurse over at the Mayo Clinic in Eau Claire, and she's going to talk about more her role in the sexual assault working with survivors.
Good evening, everyone. As she said, my name is Candace. I'm a sexual assault nurse for almost a decade. Really, what is important to remember is when we do have a victim coming forth that we are nurses first. So we're very patient focused in our role. Our position really encompasses all of our regular nursing skills that we use from day to day. But in addition, what a forensic nurse or a SANE nurse has on top of that is we've received special training through a forensic nurse examination training program that qualifies us then to better serve our victims of sexual assault. Not only do we also see and treat sexual assault victims, but any victim of domestic violence, trafficking, the pediatric population. And we also do suspect exams also if we are called to do that. Our big thing with also having that additional medical training that we put in with our patients is that we're also trauma-informed support and care. So we're just more capable, better educated, and experienced with dealing with the diverse patient populations that do come in seeking care. On top of that, we also have additional training through the Department of Justice that allows us then to also testify at court proceedings if a case does wind up going to court. So while we are nurses, we are very collaborative in multiple different areas to make sure that a victim walking in gets complete and encompass total care for whatever they have been through. Sometimes they come into the ER first to seek that care. Other times we get phone calls from patients wondering what to do or from other law enforcement agencies. Our process really starts with that patient, with giving them back the power and control over their body and the situation as a whole. In almost a decade of service, I've never seen any situations that are identical or any sexual assault nursing exam process that's identical. They're all very unique and individualized. So first, what we want to do is give our patients the options. When you come in to see a SANE nurse, that's where it's going to start with, is we have basically 3 different kinds of what I want to call tiers as the options that we give you. Some patients may choose to just want a medical exam following their assault. And What we would do then is an interview so that we can better identify any injuries that we need to address and treat. We'll also do a head to toe physical exam so that we can, find any other concerns that we may have. We'll offer them different options to make sure that their body is protected from any sexually transmitted infections that they may have received in whatever occurred. And then we'll also discuss pregnancy prevention. And anytime in this process, our victims will consent or not allow something, and that's completely within their right, and we fully respect their decision with that. That's kind of like the base exam that everything's built off of then. The next tier up that we talk about with them is sometimes they come in and everything's too fresh and they might not want to report to law enforcement right away, though we do encourage it, would be that we would do something called a non-reporting forensic exam. What that means is that we're going to, while the time is correct, we're going to collect any type of forensic evidence off the body and also do any type of photography for any injuries that we see, on top of doing also the interview still, and offering any type of sexually transmitted infection treatment and pregnancy prevention. What we do then with that non-report kit is we've collected that forensic evidence and we'll send it directly to our state crime lab in Wisconsin. And the state crime lab will hold that kit for 10 years. So that way, maybe after a few days, weeks, or even months, and there's been some more healing with that victim of crime, they may at some point then decide that they do want to proceed then with a law enforcement and have them open up an active investigation. And we have that evidence sitting there waiting for them that's been collected. So because we can't go back and recollect evidence after a certain time period, they have the 9.5 years then to make that decision. The third tier, which is the top tier that we talk about, is what we call like a reporting case. So we're going to do the interview, we're going to do the physical exam, we're going to identify any injuries that need to be treated. We're going to still offer all those sexually transmitted infection options for prophylaxis. We're going to talk about pregnancy risk and prevention. And then we're going to go in and we're going to do that full physical exam with that evidence collection. And we're also going to then contact the appropriate law enforcement agency for where that crime has been committed so that they could dispatch an officer, and they can also begin their active investigation process that occurs outside of the hospital, and obtaining maybe other evidence and talking to suspects or other people that are involved in the case. The average sexual assault exam that we're going to do is usually going to take about 4 hours. It's not a quick process. And a lot of that is built because of we're providing ongoing emotional support. And it really depends on where the survivor is in that process as to what they need from us. This is what a forensics kit kind of looks like. It's just a box. It's all encompassing and they're all the same for the state of Wisconsin. We generally don't use everything in the kit because each case is going to be very different. But inside each envelope is a different body area and a collection type that we're going to do then for our forensic evidence collection, that we then will either release it to an officer if it's a reporting case, or we're going to send it directly to the state crime lab so that they can hold that in case a victim does decide to report. And that's really our process. It sounds short and sweet, but it does take a lot of time. It's very tedious, and it can be very painful for the victim themselves because we are asking them to tell us what happened in great detail so that we don't miss anything, and so we can provide them the best care that we can. Upon discharge, we're also going to set up for any follow-ups that might be needed, whether that's with their primary care provider. We're also going to make sure that we have a patient advocate involved. We try to do that early in the process so that we have someone there with the patient also that's going to walk through the advocacy portion with them. And the advocates will talk more about their role with that. Does anybody have any questions on any of that?
I have a question. I don't know if I should just shout it out here. This is Naomi.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it seems like 10 years is a long time to keep evidence. So I'm just wondering, like, does DNA degrade over that time period? I mean, I'm a non-scientist person, so. Just
That's
wondering.
what the state crime lab has set that, and they use special coolers, freezers to freeze the evidence, so the evidence itself isn't degrading. And they set that time frame because we know that in that time period, if they do decide to report, that the evidence can be ran, and it's still good evidence. The DNA evidence that we send, all of our samples are completely dry. So that's part of the collection process that we're trained is to what can we do to make sure that evidence doesn't degrade in transport or in wait time while they process the kits or hold the kits in a non-report case. But the state crime lab would answer directly as to what they do with them there in that time. But I know the vast majority of non-report cases for the DNA and evidence is frozen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Naomi, I think Amber Hunt also had a comment about that in the chat. She just messaged it to me. If you want to talk a little bit about that, Amber.
Thanks. Yeah, I had the privilege of working on the sexual assault kit initiative in Wisconsin when I used to live in Madison. And so as a part of that initiative, the crime lab actually added on a walk-in freezer for the purpose of housing sexual assault kits. So all the kits are cataloged and stored at the crime lab in the freezer. It is the optimum setting for preservation of evidence. There is some degradation, but it's not a significant amount over time if it's properly stored. And the other reason why 10 years was chosen was because it has to do with the statute of limitations for charging sexual assault crimes. So essentially, a survivor has 10 years to determine whether they want to pursue charges. In some cases, if it goes beyond 10 years, we're not able to charge the perpetrator, but that's only in some cases. But that's why 10 years was chosen.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Candace, did you have anything else that you want to say before we move on?
I don't, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. So Candace was mentioning that during the SANE, they generally will call a victim advocate to come sit with the patient. And Kendra, that's a really good question. She just asked, how many days or hours does a victim have to do a SANE, Candace?
Generally 5 days is really what we look at. That's when we know that if there's going to be DNA evidence, that's really when we can collect it. But again, it's going to be situation on situation. We've done trafficking victims that have been held hostage and have gotten DNA evidence off. So let's say you want to come in and it's day 7, please do come in. You know, we can still collect evidence and try to see what we can get through the state crime lab. If you do decide to do a case, we're not going to turn someone away unless it's been an unreasonable amount of time. If it's 2 weeks ago and you've showered 10 or 12 times, we probably aren't going to do an evidence collection kit, but we're still going to hit all those other points that we talked about earlier.
Thank you.
If you'd like, Ange, I can talk a little bit about the advocacy side of Sane Exams and what we do as advocates. So Angie has done a wonderful job of assembling a team of volunteers who respond to SANE calls. So when we get a call, we'll have whoever's on call to volunteer show up at the hospital and meet with the victim, and the victim has the option to have the advocate stay with them through the exam process, and the advocate can also help also with the nurse walk them through what that process looks like, how things are going to go. We always bring with some materials for them. We try and bring a bag with a blanket, some maybe some snacks and a water bottle for whenever they're ready to eat. Usually, or often in these exams, people will be instructed not to eat or drink until swabs have been taken, if that's part of the exam that they wish to partake in. But we bring those things for when they're ready, just to have some comfort items and some coziness. And then we also bring some pamphlets and a booklet about what else there is, what other options are available after the Sane exam, what is next. And then we kind of just are there to offer general support. I know that can be a really scary process. Like Candace said, it can take hours. And when you're there alone, I think that can be really intimidating. So to have somebody in the room to offer support and comfort and explain things that are confusing can be really helpful. I know I always tell people that when I go to a regular doctor's appointment, what they're telling me is in one ear and out the other. So as an advocate, I think we often try to keep track of the information they're being told. We'll write things down like who the nurse is, if there's law enforcement involved, who is responding on the law enforcement side of things. If there's a case number, what is that? And write all that down so that people have that to look back on once they've left the hospital. Ange, do you have anything else to add to that?
I know, I was gonna say, one of the things that we also bring with us is a SANE book that Kat created, which actually is a nice resource for survivors. That's a space that they can write all that information in. So another thing that we do is we make sure that we bring releases of information. So that way, if those folks like want us to reach out to law enforcement or the prosecutor or victim witness or whoever they want us to speak with, we have them sign releases of information. That way we can reach out because all of our services are completely confidential. So we always want to make sure that we're getting permission before we share any of that information. But that is one of the reasons why nurses tend to make sure that there's an advocate there, because they can share things with us that they wouldn't necessarily always share with other people since it is confidential. So one of the things that we do while we're at the Sane exam, if law enforcement already isn't involved, is to go over their options for reporting to law enforcement. And so with that, Chief Atkinson and Investigator Merrifield are here to talk more about the law enforcement side of sexual assault. So Chief Atkinson, if you want to go ahead, that would be amazing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. As mentioned, my name is Eric Atkinson. I'm the Chief of Police from the Menominee Police Department, and I've been a police officer for over 23 years. And I just want to say, one, thank you for inviting myself to this program. I consider it an honor to be here. And I also want to just speak out to the courageousness of survivors of sexual assault and for their willingness to come forward and talk about what happened. And sort of touch on that, I want to provide encouragement to survivors and let them know that the process for investigating sexual assaults has changed dramatically over the last 2 decades, and much more so for the better. A big part of it is that our investigators and officers are trained as far as understanding the trauma that is impacted when it comes to surviving sexual assault, and understanding how to use empathetic responses and connecting our survivors with advocates if they haven't already reached out to them to help them through the process. So it's a much more caring process than it has been in the past. And it's also, at least I feel, much more successful in understanding how trauma impacts our victims and helping them piece together their lives and understanding what has happened to them. Now, to go over the specifics of what law enforcement does now, I'm gladly going to turn it over to Investigator Rebecca Merrifield, who is an active practitioner investigating sexual assaults. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. Like Chief Atkinson just said, I am Investigator Rebecca Merrifield. I'm with the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Prior to being in law enforcement, I was actually a victim advocate over in Eau Claire County through their district attorney's office. So I've seen kind of both sides of the law enforcement and advocacy. So I'm just really going to spend some time walking through what the steps look like from a law enforcement perspective. And it's important to note that no 2 cases are the same. I just kind of gave some general information on how cases go in the law enforcement aspect. So first is law enforcement is contacted. And a lot of times this comes in two different ways. Sometimes this occurs immediately after the incident, and other times there might be either short or long period of time after the incident occurred. And it's important to note that whether the information comes in right away or whether it comes in 2 years down the road, it doesn't change the believability of what the survivor's saying. It doesn't really change much of what we do on our end. It's kind of where the survivor might be at in their journey of processing what happened. Maybe it's a memory that the survivor didn't have at the time and something triggered it. So there's all different reasons as to why there might be kind of a time lag of when law enforcement finds out. From there, we will meet with the survivor, and we often do a minimal facts interview. This will usually be a patrol officer, so they'll come out there in uniform and they'll just get basic information, kind of the who, what, where, and when of the situation. So the who kind of helps us with who we're going to be talking to. The what gives us information on what occurred, therefore what evidence we kind of need to collect. The where, same thing, has to do with evidence, and the when really gives us a time frame of what evidence might be able to be collected, such as the Sane Exam or evidence on scene. So from there, oh, if you can go back a slide.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. From there, SANE will be arranged. We've already talked about this, so I won't really go into too many details, but oftentimes we have a conversation with the survivor about not showering, trying to avoid washing their hands, eating or drinking, using the restroom. And we also recommend that they bring extra clothes with to the SANE exam, because we might have to take their clothes as evidence at that time. Also, usually at this point, an advocate will be contacted, and a lot of these things the advocate will also go over with the survivor as well, as far as the SANE exam. From there, we will be collecting evidence and taking photos. Sorry, we're still on the other screen. Thanks. From there, we will be collecting evidence and taking photos. A lot of the evidence collection really has to do with what the minimal facts interview provided to us. Oftentimes we're taking bedding, maybe couch cushions. Sometimes we have to cut pieces of mattresses out. It all kind of depends on the situation. And then photos are also taken of the scene, not just of where the incident happened, but we'll take overall photos just to kind of give us an idea of what maybe the location looks like. I will not talk more about the SANE since we got a great, some great information from Candace. So now we can move on to the next screen. Thank you. From here, we will be doing a formal interview. So this is often when investigators like myself are contacted, and this is where we get more details. I always recommend to the survivors that if you want to have an advocate present during these interviews, because they might think of questions that the survivor has for law enforcement at that time. And then as far as the questions we ask, unfortunately, a lot of them are really uncomfortable and can be re-traumatizing, and we understand that. And so it's your journey that you're going on. So if at any point a survivor says, you know, I'm not interested in answering that question, we completely go by what they're comfortable with. Also, we always talk to the survivor that if they don't feel comfortable talking to us or who they're talking to, always ask for someone else. We won't get offended. We're just trying to make an uncomfortable situation at least a little more comfortable for the survivor. From there, we interview witnesses and suspects. A lot of times survivors don't really understand why we might want to interview witnesses. Maybe there's some concern that we don't believe the survivor. That's not the case at all. We're just trying to corroborate as much information as possible. And then as far as the suspect, it's important that survivors understand that this interview might not happen right after the incident. Sometimes it takes some time for us to get all the information we need before we interview a suspect. But our role is to be in touch with the survivor as much as possible. So I always like to give a heads up if we're going to be talking to the suspect. That way nothing's really a surprise in the investigation. So from here is kind of when we decide whether or not charges will be filed with the district attorney's office. And we work very closely with our district attorney's office to determine whether or not there's enough information for charges to be filed. If charges are not filed, it's important that the survivor understands that it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that we don't believe what they're saying. It's just there's not enough evidence at that time. And we will continue to dig for evidence. Just because at that moment we don't have enough evidence for charges to be filed doesn't mean that in 2 years we won't have enough evidence. So we'll keep pushing for that as far as charges being filed. And then once it's in the court system, law enforcement really isn't too much involved from here. We'll have to testify, but a lot of times I'll continue to keep in touch with the survivors. There might be questions, things like that, that come up. So we'll keep in touch during the court process. As far as other information, I always talk to the survivors about filing for a restraining order, and advocates will as well. But this is always something that we kind of throw in there because there might be kind of a time lag between when the incident happened to when they go to court. And it's kind of an added layer of security for the survivor that there is something in place to keep them safe. And the Bridge to Hope does a great job of working with survivors on how to get those restraining orders and apply for those. And then as far as advocacy, at the Sheriff's Office, we really appreciate what Bridge to Hope does for the survivors in our community. And we like to work as closely as possible as we can with them. That being said, survivors, be your own advocate as well. If you aren't hearing from us, harass us. This is your journey. This is your story to tell, and you know what's best for you. So please be an advocate for yourself as well. We're just kind of the sidekicks helping you along through this journey. So are there any questions for me about the law enforcement or the investigation process? That was kind of a lot of information all at once.
I don't see any questions yet, but if one pops up, I will let you know.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. And I did have a question earlier from Ashley Williams. She did have a question about the SANE team and if we accept volunteers for that. We do accept volunteers. They do go through a training process and they're interviewed. So if anybody wants more information about that, please let me know afterwards. I can send you some. And then Coltra said, be your own advocate, be the hero of your own story. Yeah, I love that. Okay, thank you for that. Next, we're going to talk more with Assistant District Attorney Amber Hahn, and she's going to go into the criminal proceedings portions of things.
So thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this presentation. And so we can click through this slide now that you've seen my lovely mugshot. So I just wanted to start out by saying that as I talk about the criminal proceeding and the court side of this, I'm going to use the term victim. And I know that that isn't always a relatable term for everyone. And so I just wanted to explain that the reason I use that term is because that is the term that's used in our statutes and in our law. So as a lawyer working in the court system, that's a term that I'm required to use in the courtroom when I make legal arguments, either in writing or orally. So that's the term I'm going to use. Also, typically when I refer to a statutory victim, what I'm referring to is a person that fits the definition in the statute. There's certainly people that may identify as a victim or a survivor that don't meet that definition. So I just threw it in here to be helpful. But generally, if we're talking about a sexual assault case, I'm working with either a victim against whom the crime has been committed, or I might be working with the parent or guardian of a child victim against whom a crime has been committed. And so that kind of goes back to this definition, and so I just want to put that out there in the beginning. We can go to the next slide. So to pick up where Investigator Merrifield left off, when law enforcement has reached a point in their investigation where they want to refer that to the district attorney's office, that is received by the office, and it is reviewed by an attorney. I currently handle all the child and adult sexual assault cases for Dunn County, so a lot of times it'll be me reviewing it. It is sometimes the district attorney or other people in the office that might review that request from law enforcement. As has kind of been the theme with the other speakers, no two cases are the same. So in some cases, when we receive that referral, we may request follow-up investigation. So we may go back to law enforcement and ask them to collect additional information. Sometimes that involves requesting document subpoenas or warrants if there's been communications that have occurred online or on social media venues or places where we think additional corroboration can be collected. Sometimes in the reviewing process, we will set up a meeting with the victim, the statutory victim I'm referring to there. And this doesn't happen in every case, but in some cases, we want to get a better sense and a face-to-face meeting with that victim about what they want to see happen with their case, and that we can discuss sort of the pros and cons of the different options going forward. So in some cases, we will do a meeting with the victim. In some cases, we have what's called a pre-charge meeting with a defendant. Defendant is a word that I use for an individual that may be charged with a crime. So by defendant, I just mean a person that may be charged with, in this case, a sexual offense. That doesn't happen in every case, but there are some circumstances where we may choose to talk to the alleged perpetrator or a person who is alleged to have committed the crime about resolving that case and to have that discussion prior to formal charges being filed. So those are all possible things that might happen during that review process. Also, by definition of law, once a crime has been reported to law enforcement, victim witness services or victim rights that are defined in our chapter 950 of our statutes in Wisconsin applies to the person against whom the crime was committed. So what that means is if a survivor of sexual assault chooses to report that to law enforcement, or if it is somehow reported to law enforcement by another person, the rights under our law then attach to that person. So that statutory victim then has those rights. I've only listed a few of the rights. There are many more rights than what I listed here, but these are the most common ones. The first is the right to notification of any hearings. So as it proceeds through the court system, as a victim, you are entitled to have notice of any court proceedings involving your case. Upon the request, you have the opportunity to consult with the attorney, the prosecutor. I use the shorthand there for assistant district attorney. You have a right to make a statement at sentencing. So in the event the person is convicted or enters a plea to the charge, you would have a right to make a statement at their sentencing. And the victim also has a right to restitution, which is defined under the statute, but that can sometimes be monetary recompense for things that the victim has suffered as a result of the crime committed against them. So again, those aren't all of the rights, but that's the main ones that we see. So once we've reviewed the referral, we're either going to make a decision to charge or not charge that referral. If there's a decision made in the district attorney's office not to charge the referral, a letter is sent to the victim through the mail, and that always happens. And then if a person, and on that letter is our contact information, and if the victim receiving that letter wants to meet with us about that decision, that is an opportunity that they can take upon request. So we send those letters out. A lot of times we don't hear back from them, from people who receive a letter like that. And so then, But if someone does receive that letter and wants to speak with us about that decision, we will absolutely meet with that person. If the case is charged, a number of things will happen. And every case is not the same, but typically one of the first things that'll happen is an initial appearance. And that'll occur whether the case is a felony or a misdemeanor. And at the initial appearance, typically we will set a bail or a bond for the defendant, the person charged with the crime. Certain conditions can be put on that bond or bail. And if a person violates those conditions, they can be charged with additional crimes. Bail and bond hearings kind of get a bad name because of, I think, a lot of what we see on television. And so I just want to take a moment to stress that what the law actually says about bail or bonds is that a person charged with a crime, the main purpose of that is to ensure their return to court. I think from watching television, a lot of us think that the main purpose of a bail bond is to actually protect the community and protect the victim. And while those are certainly important factors that the court can consider, it's actually not the legal main purpose of a bail bond hearing. So a lot of times, victims and survivors are very upset because an individual that's been charged with a sexual assault may not be held in custody. That person very likely may be released on a bond to go back to live in the community. And that can be very difficult, I think, for some survivors to understand. And so we try to explain as best we can what's going on in those bail bond hearings and what's happening there. We can ask for no contact conditions and other conditions that might apply in a particular case to try to, make the victim feel more safe. But that's another situation where sometimes we would encourage a restraining order if a bail bond hearing doesn't turn out the way the victim or survivor hopes. So that's sort of the first step in the process. After we've done an initial appearance, if it's a felony offense, we also do what's called a preliminary hearing, which is a short presentation of the facts so that the court can determine whether there's enough evidence to proceed with the case. After that, we enter what's called the negotiations or offer for settlement time period. At this point, if the victim has indicated they want to receive this right, we will confer with the victim prior to making an offer of settlement. And typically what that means is we will say to the person who is accused of committing a crime that if they do not wish to take the case to trial, and if instead they want to enter a plea of guilty or no contest to one or more charges instead of going to trial, we'll specify what that might look like. Then after the negotiation or offer of settlement time period is typically what I'm using a really general term here to say pretrial litigation. Every case is very different and it's hard to say exactly what this will look like. Some cases have a lot of pretrial litigation. And what that means is the parties will file different motions or things that they are asking the court to decide as far as what is allowed at a trial and what a jury or a court may be allowed to hear as far as the evidence. Some cases there's very little of this. Some cases this can go on for a year or more. So it's just, that's a very broad term that's covering sort of a whole lot of stuff. Then if they don't agree to take a settlement offer or a plea and we've completed pretrial litigation, the next step is to go to a trial. This can be in front of a judge or a jury. Most circumstances it's going to be a jury, but a defendant can waive their right to a jury if they choose to do so, and it can be heard by a single judge. Before any trial would take place, typically what I'll do is I will meet with the victim or survivor, and we'll do what's called witness preparation. This is also kind of a really broad term that can take on a lot of different meanings depending on each individual case. But I try really hard to fit that preparation to what the victim indicates is most helpful to them. So in some cases that involves going into the courtroom when nobody else is there and having an opportunity to see that space and see what they might see on the day that they provide their testimony. For some victims, that's not helpful. But at the very least, victim preparation will involve a meeting with me. We'll go through what we think the anticipated testimony will be. And if the individual wants to, I will practice cross-examination or what I think likely questions from the defense attorney might be. And then there's the trial itself. So that's kind of, in many ways, sort of the end of that piece of it. And we can go on to the next slide. Assuming there's been either a plea or a trial that resulted in a conviction, sort of the last step in the process is sentencing. So if an individual has entered a plea and been convicted that way, or has been convicted by a jury or a judge at a trial, a sentencing hearing is scheduled. There's a couple pieces to talk about with sentencing hearings. First of all, one of those rights that a victim has under the statute is to be consulted in any pre-sentence investigation. And what that is a judge can ask a member of the Department of Corrections to complete a written investigation, including certain information about the defendant, to help the judge have more information when the judge imposes a sentence. And so typically it's a probation agent working for the Department of Corrections, and they will write up information pertaining to the defendant. A victim under the statute has a right to have an input in that pre-sentence investigation. So a person writing that investigation will contact the victim and ask for comment. Victims also have a right to be present at the sentencing hearing, and they have a right to make a victim impact statement. So a victim impact statement is pretty broad term. It can be whatever really the person wants. The only restrictions usually are that courts usually request that those statements be addressed to the court and not directly to the defendant. But that can vary a little bit. But it's basically an opportunity for the victim to tell the court how this crime has impacted them and what they would like to see happen with the offender or the defendant. There's other rights that I've kind of skipped over. I didn't want to take up too much time, although I see I'm already kind of chatty. But there's, in Wisconsin, if you've heard the term Marsy's Law, Marsy's Law was passed recently. It does expand the rights of victims. And I didn't want to get into all the nitty gritty of that, but there are some additional rights for victims to be heard in different types of proceedings that they maybe weren't heard in before. And there's a little bit more clarity, I think, in the court system since Marsy's Law came to be, that has really, I think, opened all of our eyes here working in the court system about the importance and the presence of the rights of victims. And I think that hopefully we're making really good strides at being more inclusive and making a better process for victims. And I think just one final comment I'd like to say is that in the time that I've been working with victims of sexual assault and prosecuting these types of cases, and really victims in all types of crimes, I am continually blown away just by the strength and amazing perseverance of people who have suffered a crime being committed against them. And I kind of went over this pretty fast, but if I'm completely honest, it's not an easy process to go through. I don't think any victim who's ever been a part of a criminal case has looked at the whole process as a whole and, you know, loved every minute of it. It's, I think, not a process anyone chooses to be a part of if they can help it. But the biggest thing I think for me is communication. And I always really appreciate just hearing from victims or survivors about either if they've already gone through the process or they're presently going through the process, things we can do better, things that went well or didn't go well. And as has been already said, you know, be the hero in your own story and advocate for yourself. And that absolutely means, you know, amongst the process as well. And in my role, I tend to be the voice of the victim in these proceedings, even though I don't represent the victim. I represent the state of Wisconsin as a prosecutor. Because of just how the system is set up, I tend to be the one that gets to talk in court most of the time. So I guess the only message I would hope to get out is just, you know, communicate with us and communicate with our office and communicate with me if I'm the prosecutor on your case, because I'm absolutely interested in your input and definitely open to doing things in a better way. So I'll leave it at that. And If anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Thank you so much for being so transparent and just open, and really being open to that feedback, because I know that that's not always easy. And I really do appreciate that, because I think as advocates, we know like the process is so difficult and long and grueling. And so I appreciate that you point that out, because I think sometimes people miss that point. They really do think it's like an episode of Law and Order or something where, you know, it's just wham bam and you're done, and they don't realize that it can take years, you know, months and years, and that you have to keep reliving that experience. And so the fact that you're so open and honest about that, I really appreciate that.
All right. Next, we're going to go into the university side of things a little bit. As I mentioned previously, I am the campus advocate on the UW Stout campus. So I primarily work with student survivors, and one of the biggest things I talk with them about is who can you report to on your campus? Who can you talk to? What are your resources? And Jacqueline has been an absolutely amazing resource on the UW Stout campus, and I've stayed very well connected with her, and we're lucky enough to have her joining us tonight to tell us a little bit about what the whole process looks like from a university standpoint. So take it away, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much, Kat, and I'm honored to be here with you all tonight. My name is Jacqueline Bonneville, and I'm the Interim Associate Dean of Students here at UW Stout. Although it's only my first year in this role, specifically, I have been working with students in higher education for 27 years, and serving 11 of those years as a Title IX investigator, which is really kind of one sliver of my whole job, but I've seen a lot through my time. I've been at Stout for 4 years, but before that, I worked at UW Eau Claire. So what I'm going to talk about today, based on our student conduct code, is really similar between the UW system schools. So although I work at Stout now, I can kind of share with you a process that's going to look very similar if you were to talk to a student at River Falls or a student at Eau Claire or Whitewater. I also get to chair our Sexual Violence Coalition on campus, which is a wonderful group of many people who are here tonight, but both students, campus advocates, and people in our community kind of coming together around sexual violence and prevention in that way. So you can, oh, there you're already there. So I just want to talk a little bit about our process, and it is kind of probably way more thorough than you want to know, but I'm happy that you'll have access to this information to go back to it, because I put a lot of details kind of on the slide. But something that's really important for people to know, and I don't think they always fully understand, is that we have to operate under our student conduct code. That is what our jurisdiction, if you will say, is during cases, whether we're talking about sexual violence or sexual misconduct or anything else. In Wisconsin, we are one of 2 states that actually has our student conduct code as state statute. It's called Chapter 17. And there's a few things I want you to understand about that. One is that because it's state statute, it is slow to change. So if anyone is paying attention to this kind of stuff, in May of 2020, Betsy DeVos, sent out new regulations in terms of Title IX and really giving more rights to students who are accused of sexual misconduct. So our process then starts to try to get our code up to date to meet these new regulations. That is still kind of in process, federal law, Trump state law. So it's confusing in terms of that. And we're trying to adhere to both, but it's hard when they're not in alignment. But that's still in process with our state legislature right now. And now we have a new president who will likely issue new guidance. So just to kind of help you with that. The other piece is, I explain this when we talk about our process with students. The major thing we have any jurisdiction over is whether you're a student or not. So when we talk to students about their rights and their decisions about which process they want to be a part of, ours is really the biggest consequence you could have through our conduct code is that you would be expelled from the UW system, meaning you may not attend any UW system school for the rest of your life. Of course, that very rarely happens, but we often suspend students, which means you're out for a period of time, no greater than 2 years. But there's a whole, array of different sanctions that can happen, but it's important for people to know that. And I have to say, I've been around long enough that I remember at the very beginning of my work, when there were reports of sexual assault or sexual misconduct, we used to often wait for the police to do their whole investigation. And we just heard how long that can take. And we would sit on these reports and not make any movement student-wise until that had been completed. And we had been told that we weren't to interfere with their investigation, and we needed to let that process, go through its entirety if a student were to choose to do both. That has since changed, and our process now runs simultaneously to what the police are doing if a student were to choose to use both. And I think that's really important because it has made us more agile. Like, we try to, from beginning to end, complete an investigation in about 60 days. That's what we try to do. Doesn't always totally happen, depending on semester breaks or summer breaks, or if the student were to choose to appeal, that can certainly lengthen the process. But you can see that that's a positive thing, that we can do these things at the same time, especially for a student who might go forward, with a criminal process that could take much, much longer. So if you want to go to the next slide, Angie, I just want to explain that at our institution, many employees are deemed responsible employees. And that means that they receive training that they have to make a report if a student were to tell them that there was sexual misconduct. And they also are trained about how to best support a student and to provide the options for them if a student does report to them. So that's very important for us, and you'll hear a lot about really making sure that we're providing support for our students. Many times a report is given to us, and the person, we call them complainants and respondents. So the respondent, the person accused, is not a Stout student or not a student at another institution, right? Could be just someone in the community, could be someone back home. Well, we have no jurisdiction over that person then. So then we really go into full-on support and making sure that they have the resources and support here on campus that they need. And we usually start with what are the confidential places that people can report, and Kat is just our number one. We are so grateful to have an advocate on campus, and I will just hope that we're able to keep that for the long term, because at UW Eau Claire we had that also, and it's just it's worth its weight in gold. Like, to have someone here that we can direct students to is just so wonderful. Then counseling services, of course, and health services and clergy are another place that students could go for confidential reporting. Things have changed a little bit in here now, where if someone comes forward about sexual misconduct and they do not wish to file a formal complaint with us as an institution, there's likely going to be no further action other than, again, surrounding them with support, making sure they have the resources they need. There are some things I'm going to talk about that we can put in place to help protect the student, like no contact orders, sometimes moving residence halls, talking about access to buildings, class schedules. There are things like that that can happen without a full investigation. So we always talk to the student about what those kind of look like. So that's a little bit different. So when we hear of a complainant coming forward, one of the first things we do is have them, if they're willing, meet with our Title IX coordinator. And every university has a Title IX coordinator. In fact, you're supposed to be able to find that on the website, who that person is. Here at UW Stout, that is Sandy Scott, and she's our Dean of Students, and she's been doing this work for a long, long time. So we try to arrange a time for the two of them to meet. That is where Sandy will explain to the student what our process looks like here at UW Stout. Again, not trying to sugarcoat that this is a fun process by any means, helping them understand what the range of sanctioning that we actually have is, reminding them or explaining to them that we need to meet the preponderance of evidence standard in order to find responsibility. That's the word that we use as we go through, and again, reminding them that even if that evidence threshold is not met, it certainly does not mean that this did not happen. So after that meeting, we tell them that they have a right to an advisor. Of course, they can bring someone with. We have many students who do that throughout the whole process in any of the meetings. We explain that they can end here if they do not wish to proceed. That would be their right. And now something that has changed is that if there is no further action by the Title IX coordinator, unless if we're identifying such an overriding safety concern for our campus. That would be the only time that we would investigate or move forward without consent of the person making the complaint. And that's different than it had been in the past. So Angie, you can go to the next one. This is a little bit about what our process looks like. And again, like I said, it's long, and I'm sorry about that. I tried to break it down as well as I could, but that Title IX coordinator, like I said, would meet with the respondent also to review resources if a complaint is filed, a report is filed. They also have access to resources. We talk about the interim safety measures. They also can have an advisor explain the process. And if we issue no contact orders, which is different from a restraining order, but we often see it very helpful for us as a campus community, saying you may not have contact with each other, you may not send your friends to have contact with this person, you may not, if you are at a space and this person arrives, you need to leave that space, some things like that. So we put those in place quite often on a college campus, but specifically in this area, this is something that we do often. If we're moving forward after that conversation, the Title IX coordinator will then assign investigators. And those are often people that work here at the institution. Like I said, I have been an investigator on cases before. We pair up, which I really appreciate. So there's two of us that really works well. One of us may be taking more notes where the other one can just be more present with the student and really be there to ask good questions and kind of lead through that process. Again, you heard the equity in these systems is very important right now in terms of our code. So both the respondent and complainant receive notice of an investigation and the allegation. So that's important. The investigators will gather information. They'll do interviews, of course, with both the students involved, but they can also interview witnesses. So quite often other students or other people that might have information that would be helpful get called in to be part of that investigation. After they have completed their investigation, they draft a report, just citing all of the interviews that they had and also summarizing any evidence that they have. And both parties are allowed to review that report and they get a chance to respond to the report. Like, I agree with this, I don't agree with this, and this is here why. And then that is included as part of the report. So when that report is done, it is submitted to an independent hearing officer. So that was who will make the determination if preponderance of evidence has been met and if we are going forward. And at that point, then if preponderance of evidence has been met, a hearing is actually conducted. And that is again resulting in the determination if that evidence has been met. And so we go through the hearing process. We haven't had one of these this year at UW Stout in this way. So I've been part of lots of hearings, before in my life and different things, not always around sexual misconduct, although some have been. And then at the end of all of that, both parties have a right to appeal. So we walk them through kind of what their appeal options and what that could look like in this process. So that's a little bit about UW Stout and how things might look there. And now I think it's Sammy's turn.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
All right, yep, now we're gonna head on over to Sammy, who also works for UW Stout up at the Counseling Center, and she's gonna tell us a little bit about the importance of mental health care after experiencing trauma and how that looks in particular for students, but for everybody really.
Wonderful, thank you.
Go ahead,
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you.
All right, so first of all, thank you, Jacqueline. I know that's a lot of information to kind of share, but also really good information. I work closely with Jacqueline as well on a lot of things on campus. I'm one of the licensed counselors in the Counseling Center at Stout. So most of my time is spent with students in clinical work, so meeting with them in individual sessions, group counseling. We also do couples counseling, and then we have crisis counseling as well, where students can call between 8 to 4:30, Monday through Friday, and they usually can meet with a counselor within 15 minutes for crisis appointments as well. So most of my time is done with students in clinical work, but then I'm also the outreach coordinator. And so I try to connect with students in different aspects and not just counseling. I also try to connect with them on campus in presentations like this, in educational events on campus, but also in fun ways as well. We really try to reduce that stigma around mental health and kind of open that conversation around mental health. So today I'm going to specifically be talking about these 4 areas. I think I could talk a long time on these areas, but specifically we're going to talk a lot about trauma and mental health, the counseling process in general, both on campus and off campus. I like to always pop the wellness wheel up and talk a little bit more about what a session might look like if a student does come to counseling and wants to process sexual trauma or just trauma in general. And the wellness wheel is kind of a really great place to start that feels comfortable and safe without just jumping into the trauma and the mental health aspects. And then lastly, I will leave you with some resources again on and off campus, because it's really beneficial for students to feel connected on campus, but also off campus as well. Thanks, Angie. So again, this is a very broad overview, but I tried to pick out some of the main aspects between trauma and mental health and what we talk with students about in individual counseling, and then sometimes also in group counseling. We do have group counseling every semester, and so students find a lot of processing and therapy between connecting with their peers in group counseling, which is led by a counselor in our office. But individual and group are kind of 2 options that students can choose if they do want to process trauma in the counseling center. I like to highlight these areas because I think they're really important for students that are in counseling, but also students that aren't in counseling as well, and maybe struggling with something that happened in the past or recent, but they haven't shared it yet. So I really like to point out that trauma in general, specifically any sexual assault or emotional, mental, or physical trauma is different for everyone. I think that's kind of been highlighted in all the different aspects that we've kind of heard tonight, but it's different for everyone. And that definition of what a traumatic experience is identified by the specific person. And so when we talk with a student in that first initial appointment, we'll talk with them about they can share as little or as much as they want. And so sometimes students will come in and they'll share they have a traumatic experience that they like to talk about, but they're not ready to talk about it yet. And that is completely okay with us. We don't have a limit of how many sessions students can attend. And so sometimes it might be, they disclose information in the first session about a traumatic experience that they've had, or it might take 10 or 12 sessions. And so there's not a limit on counseling sessions, which I think is really important because everybody's definition of trauma is different. We also talk with students right away that our sessions are confidential and they're free of charge. And so students aren't getting charged with how many sessions that they do attend, which I think is really important so that they can take the time that they need. Of course, we do identify that if there is any intent for them to harm themselves or others, that is when confidentiality is broken. But we would, of course, talk with the student before that happens, just again, to keep them safe and others on campus and off campus safe. We talk a lot with students about the amount of time that it takes to process a trauma is undefined. And so it might be a short time or a long time or no recommended time at all. And so I think that's really important because a lot of times there's kind of a myth behind how long it takes to process trauma. And so that can be different for each survivor. And of course, a lot of the times counseling and the counseling process is focused around a sense of control or power that's been taken away from the individual who is a survivor. And so we talk about a lot of different aspects, mainly the mental, emotional, and physical traumas that they've been through. And in a couple more slides, I'll talk a little bit about the wellness wheel and why that's so important to kind of help students identify the different aspects of their life that have been affected and how we can kind of process through that in counseling. This is a really important one because trauma, when it occurs or if it's occurred in the past, we also have to look at other mental illnesses might be occurring at the same time or have become this new symptom that they have to process as well. And so a lot of the times it's not just the trauma that occurred, but the student might be also struggling with depression or anxiety or an eating disorder or body image issues or maybe OCD or family stressors, relational stressors. And so a lot of the time, we really want this process in counseling to be a slow and just really empowering time for the students so that they can take that time that they need to kind of gain that control and power back by processing what occurred to them, but also the other mental illnesses that they might be struggling with. Intrusive thoughts of suicidality and homicidality are always talked about in counseling. We do a safety assessment throughout counseling. They also fill out data and paperwork through our system and our confidential system so that we can make sure that the student is safe. It can be very common that students struggle with suicidality or homicidality, intrusive thoughts in general after a traumatic event has occurred. And so we definitely want to make sure that the students have a safe space to process that as well. And then lastly, probably the most important sentence that I can say in this presentation is that you're not alone. It feels like you might be alone, but again, we want counseling to be that safe space for the students, and not right away. It may take years, it might take months, it might take sessions. But again, we really want those students to know that they're not alone. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in a nutshell, the counseling process at Stout, like I said, is confidential for students and it is free. It's no additional cost to the students. And so we really want students to feel like they have a space. Currently we're doing telehealth counseling, but usually we have this, physical space for students to come to in our offices. Usually when a student starts counseling, like I said, they get to decide when they feel comfortable talking about any trauma or any abuse that has happened in their life. And so we want them to be able to use counseling as a resource, but we want it to be on their own terms. So we will do an intake process in the beginning of counseling, and we'll ask about a lot of different areas, presenting problems, symptoms that they're struggling with, any relational struggles, maybe family struggles, medical history, things like that. And we'll also ask about trauma and abuse. And so often I'll ask students if there's anything that they want to share at this time, but I also make sure that they know if they don't want to share at this time, they can do that in their own terms. Counseling is, again, a safe space for students to feel like they can talk to a professional who's trained in how to help. And, friends and support systems are so important, but sometimes it's really helpful too to get those techniques and tools on how to process the trauma that they might have experienced. Safety and support is definitely one of the first things that we outline in counseling, and we want to make sure that they're safe, especially if they were in an abusive relationship or they're feeling unsafe. We want to make sure that they get connected to other resources like the Bridge to Hope in the community, but also, including law enforcement if we need to make sure that they are safe. So I outlined as a main therapy that we use to process a lot of trauma. Cognitive processing therapy is a therapy that we use to focus on how to connect. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry about that.
Sorry, that's okay. I was like, wait, where did I go? So oops, back or forward one slide.
Technology is just not working.
That's okay, it's hard, I feel ya. All right, so cognitive processing therapy is the therapy that we use most commonly. But again, we do present different options of therapy and different counseling processes that we can use with students just so that they have an option. A lot of students, will say, I don't know. And so we'll kind of talk through as to what we think might be most beneficial for them and most helpful for them to process through the therapy. So cognitive processing therapy, like I said, focuses on the talk therapy piece of counseling. So processing through the traumatic event in the time that they feel like is safe for them to do. But then also talking a lot about the guilt and the shame that comes from experiencing a sexual assault. And so we want to recreate those thinking patterns by processing the automatic thoughts that are kind of triggering off in their brain. So a lot of anxiety, a lot of depressive symptoms often come after trauma occurs. We want to make sure that we create the safe space so that we can kind of process the things, the thoughts, the feelings that are occurring. Cognitive processing therapy links the thoughts and feelings with the behaviors. And so how can we make sure that you on a day-to-day basis are feeling safe and are feeling like your self-worth is continuing to be built up? Again, guilt and shame are a huge piece that we focus on because a lot of the times students do have those feelings of this was my fault or how could I have prevented this? And so we really want to work through those unhelpful beliefs so that students feel like they can recreate kind of who they are, having the trauma be a part of their past and not a part of who they currently are. So we work through that conceptualization, and it sounds easy when I say it like this, but it takes a lot of time, and we want to create that safe space so that students feel like they can use counseling as a beneficial tool for them. Like I said earlier, individual counseling is what most students choose just because it feels safer to have to to not have to share your story in front of others. But again, some students choose group counseling as well, which has been beneficial as well. All right, next slide. Perfect, thank you. So lastly, before I talk about resources, I wanted to throw this slide up there because this is something we'll talk with students about when they first start counseling, when they don't really know where to start and they don't really want to share their story yet. These are a lot of different areas of life, but they all kind of tie together in a wellness wheel. And so a lot of the times we think about sexual assault being a physical trauma, an emotional trauma, but we often don't think about the other areas of life that it can affect as well. And so a lot of the times I will share this on my screen or I'll show it to a student in session prior to COVID. And we'll talk a little bit about like, how has your social life changed? You know, tell me when you feel anxious in a social setting and why that might be. Or why is work different? You know, how is your environment different? Or do you take a different path on campus because of what happened when you're walking to class? Intellectually, are you unable to focus in classes? A lot of different areas that we want to talk with students about to kind of open up that space for them to process how this trauma has affected all the areas of their life. And again, it's a long process. It can be a shorter process as well, but we really want to make sure that students are kind of highlighting the different areas of their life and how can we build that stronger. Next slide. Perfect, thank you. So lastly, again, this is kind of mental health in a nutshell, but I wanted to end on resources so that if you've already found support and you want more support, or if you feel like this might be the time that you want to reach out to a resource, the Counseling Center is here for you if you're an enrolled Stout student. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. I can send more resources or I can pop it in the chat after this. But what I really want to outline is that it's in your control, it's in your hands as to how you want to process something that happened to you that might be traumatic. So the Counseling Center is definitely here for you. You can request or have a preference of which counselor you do see. So you're not just randomly selected or chosen to a counselor. If you prefer a female counselor over a male counselor, older, younger, you very much can have that preference. So make sure that you know, if that is part of the paperwork when you do fill it out, that you identify that. There are a ton of community resources, again, like the Bridge to Hope. Kat is a wonderful advocate on our campus, and we're so thankful to have her. The Bridge to Hope as well. And then there's a ton of community resources. If you don't feel comfortable seeking counseling on campus, we have some students that will reach out and consult with us, but they don't want to do counseling on campus just for their safe space. We can definitely get you connected with community resources. So you can meet with one of our counselors who's a case manager who will get you connected with resources that fit in your insurance. She'll help you call, things like that. The Dean of Students Office, you heard Jacqueline kind of chat tonight about a lot of information and kind of how she's an advocate for students on campus. So we're really thankful for Jacqueline and the Dean of Students Office. Silver Cloud is an app that students can use on campus. It's a really good way to kind of check in with yourself mental health wise. So if you're not ready to make the leap into counseling or connect with a community resource, Silver Cloud is a free app that you can use if you're a Stout student. It's also available to faculty and staff. And of course, other mental health apps sometimes are where students like to start. And then as you'll see, I also put the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and text line on here. And then Northwest Connections, which clearly I forgot an 8 in the number, but that's a really good local connection as well. Of course, law enforcement and our campus police are really great resources. If you have questions, you can reach out to them in the non-emergency line. I know we've had students do that, but of course they're another good resource. So that's mental health in a nutshell. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. You can also contact our office as well, and I will put our email and our office number in the chat.
Thank you so much, Sammy. So before we continue, we just really want to thank all of our panelists and all of our guests for coming tonight and sharing your experiences. Before we go any further, we're going to stop the recording so that way we can share some survivor love letters that we've received from the community members. And then we're going to allow space for folks to share if they want to. Just want to make sure we don't have any questions. Does anybody have any questions before we go any further? And thanks for putting those resources in the chat box too. That's amazing.
Yes, absolutely.
Reiterate what Angie said. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's really, really meaningful to us. For those of you who joined us in this presentation, thank you. As advocates, we couldn't do it without you. I think it's so important that we all work together and pool our resources for the betterment of everybody and help create a safe and welcome space for victims and survivors to thrive and create a better future.